Welcome back everyone, and in today's video what I want to do is change a little bit one of our functions. So we have the remove amount at index, which removes the amount from the index from the specific slot, and it works just fine. And also we have a function called RemoveItem, which we can simply provide an item at slot structure, and then it finds it and it gets removed. But since now we have a slot limit on it, well, we could have some issues with it because it's going to only return us a single stack, and perhaps a single stack is not enough. And also once we modify this function, it's going to be reused in our crafting to make our crafting work a little bit more better, so that it would use all of the possible slots that we have. So let's go to our third-person character and let's start working on this. But before we can actually modify our remove items function, well, we're gonna need another function in here, because our find stack function, well, it's not gonna work exactly like we want it to. So what I'm gonna do is create a new function, and I'm gonna call this return stacks, so that we would know how many items we have all together throughout all of our possible stacks. For this one, we need a single input, which is going to be the, I'm going to call this the item, and this is our S slots structure type. And since I want to prioritize my backpack to be the first place from which the items get removed rather than the player slots, what I'm going to do first is drag in my equipped backpack reference so that I know all the things I need to know from the backpack. And of course, first we need to check if this is valid, so whether our character has actually picked up a backpack. Then once we've done that, once we've checked if it's valid, we can get the slots from our backpack, and then from these slots we can run a loop. So let's run a loop for each. Let's loop through the whole thing, through our whole backpack, and from there then let's split our array element. So the S slot structure, I'm gonna split the item itself as well, and from the item, from the input, I'm gonna do exactly the same thing. So I'm gonna break this, and I'm gonna break the data table row handle as well. And what I want to check for is that the row name from the item that we are passing along is equal to the item that we have found in our player slots. So from the loop body, we can do a if branch check and use this boolean as a condition to see whether both of those are the same items. Now, once we've done that, if this is true, well, then we need to store this item. So what I'm going to do is create a new local variable, and I'm going to call this local items. Local items multiple, and what I will reuse is my quick slot structure. If you don't have one, this is a very basic structure. All it has is a string field, which contains a text for us, and an index, which is an integer. So I'm gonna drag that in, and I will simply add to this. Alright, so let's do so. And yeah, make sure you set this to be an array instead of being a single entry. So this is an array, so we add to an array, and then we can make our slot structure. And in this case, so here we are checking and looping through the backpack. So in the item source, I will type in inventory, since throughout this whole system I'm using the tag to be inventory for my backpack, and for the index I'm gonna use the array index. I'm not actually going to reuse this index value. All I need is the item source value, but just maybe in the future we could use those values as well, so I'm gonna plug in the index as well. And also, one more thing that we will want to put out is the amount of items that we have throughout our whole inventory. So I'm gonna add a new variable, local variable, and I'm gonna call this local amount on player, and this is going to be a integer, and this needs to be a single variable. Now at the end, when we add to our local items, we want to drag in our local amount on player. We want to get this value, and we want to do a plus. So what we found before plus the amount that we found in our backpack. So this amount right here goes in here, and then we can set our local amount players to be this newly created value, like so. So now this is going to collect the entire amount of items, and it's gonna give us the result. Now, so this is all good and done for the backpack part. Now we need to do pretty much the same thing for our player slots. So what I will simply do is from the loop, copy all of this junk right here, copy this down below, because, well, we need pretty much the same thing, but instead of typing in the item source inventory, in this case this is going to be the player. These are going to be my player slots rather than the backpack ones. So now for the data table row handle, just like previously, let's drag from the input item, let's break that and connect the item to the data table row handle. And for the RI, we can in this case use our player slots. There we go. And for the execution, well, we want to run from our first loop's completion. We want to run the execution, and also we want to run it if the backpack is not valid. So if it's not valid, we directly jump to the checking our player slots and we skip the backpack. So far so good. Now the last thing left for us to do is return. So from the second loop's completion, once we have completed all of our loops, we can simply return. So add a return node. And for this one, well, we need a couple of outputs. So let's have a first one, which is going to be our, let's call this items. And this needs to be our quick slots structure. And this needs to be an RI, since, well, in the local variables we have the RI, and then another output would be our let's call this amount on player, which is going to be a single variable integer. There we go. And now we can plug in our local variables. So our local items and local amount on player now is getting passed through. And so we are done with this function right here. So it should look at the end something like this. And now we can go and work on our RemoveItem function. So I don't like deleting all of this stuff right away. First, I want to make sure that everything is working, and then I'm going to remove that. So I'm going to drag down the function node itself, and then I will promote the item to a local variable, and keeping the pattern alive, let's call this local item. There we go. So we have that referenced, and then we want to run our newly created function called return stacks. And over here we can then get our local item, plug that in, and now it's gonna look through the system and try to find as many items as it can. Then what we want to do is from this amount on player, we want to check if this value is bigger or equal to the amount from the local item. So let's break this. Break the slot structure, plug in the amount in the second route, and now this basically checks whether we have more or equal amount of items that is required to be removed. So let's do a if branch check on this to make sure that, well, we have plenty of items to be removed before we actually try to remove something. Now if this is false, then we can directly run to our return node, and we can return false on this. But if this is true, if we have plenty of items, what we want to do is run a loop from our items from the return stack. So let's do a loop for each, and we need to do this with a break. So once we remove plenty of items, we can stop the loop and stop removing the items. And then on our loop, we can break our quick slot structure, and I'm gonna do a switch on string based on the item source, so where the item is coming from. And in my case, I'm only going to have two entries. So the first one is going to be the inventory, and the second one is going to be the player. So first, let's work on our inventory, of course. So let's drag in our equip backpack. There we go. We have that. And from here, what we want to do is simply find a stack. So let's find a stack. Let's plug that into our inventory. And for the item input, we can plug in our local item. So there we go. So at this point in time, we are already sure that we have plenty of items because, well, we are returning all of the stacks and checking whether the returned amount is bigger than the amount that is required to remove. So what we are going to do is drag in our local item, and let's split that because, well, we need the amount, and we want to make sure that the local amount that we are trying to remove is smaller or equal to the amount that is found in the stacks. And also we want to do a check whether we have actually found something. So let's do a AND Boolean check from the success. Let's plug in the amount check over here, and then from the execution we can run a if branch check and use this add node as our condition for this one. Unfortunately, I have made a tiny mistake, but I don't want to redo the whole video because of a single very tiny issue. So what I told you guys is that this integer check should be that the amount is at the bottom, and then at the top you have the local amount. So I believe in the video it looked something like this. That is not correct. These need to be the other way around. Just like I'm creating later on for the player, this is correct. The found stack amount needs to be at the top and the local amount needs to be at the bottom, and this applies for both of these. So basically this amount needs to be at the top and then the local amount must go to the bottom, like so, and then everything else is correct, everything is just fine. This was a tiny mistake that I made. Now if this is true and if this is false, in both cases we want to remove amounts at indexes, but we want to remove different amounts. So I'm gonna drag in the equip backpack and I'm going to remove amount at index, plug that in here, and copy another one and plug that into false as well, connect the targets for both of those. And like I said, at this point we already know that we do have plenty of items. So for the index we're going to use the find stack index because it is going to find us a stack with those items. Now on the top route, if the removable amount is smaller, then for the amount we want to use the amount from the find stack function. So let's plug that in here. But if this is false, that means, well, that there is plenty of items in the found stack, and for the amount then we want to remove the amount that is in the local item. Now from the false route, so if we have if we are running on the false, that means, well, we have removed plenty of items and we no longer need to remove any other items. Then from the bottom one we can go directly to the break and be done with the loop and stop removing items from our inventory. So let's reroute this to make this look a little bit nicer. But, well, if this is true, that means we have removed some of the items, but we haven't removed plenty enough. So what we want to do is, again, let's drag in our local item. Let's split that. And also we want to set this variable. So make sure we set this. I'm going to split it right here. And so I'm going to connect the item itself and I'm going to connect its type. But for the amount, what I'm going to do is drag from the local amount, do a minus. So integer minus integer, and I'm going to remove the amount that I found in the stack. So this amount right here, and then this goes into our amount that is still needed to be removed. So basically we are finding a stack, we are looking at it and checking whether it has less items than we need to remove. If there is less items that are needed to be removed, we are removing the whole stack and removing that amount from the local item. But if we have plenty of items, then, well, we are just simply removing the amount that is needed and finishing the loop. Now for the player, we're gonna do pretty much the same thing, but, well, we don't need the equip backpack. So from the player we can just simply find a stack. So let's find the stack, let's plug in our local item over here, there we go. Then from the success we can do a AND boolean check. Then let's drag in our local item once more. It's gonna be a little bit easier with the wires, so split that and check if the amount is smaller or equal to the amount that is needed. So this one goes in the B route, and then we can do a if branch check on this one, plug that in. There we go, our condition is all set up. Then we can run two of our remove amounts at index, just like we did at the top. So remove amount at index on this one as well, and just like previously. So for the indexes we are using the find stack index. For the amounts on the top one we are using the amount from the find stack. On the bottom one we are using the amount from the local item. Now for the RIs, of course we want to use our player slots RI instead of our equipment, because, well, this is a reusable function which can be used for both of those RIs. And then from the bottom one, again, we want to go to the break. So I'm just going to simply connect it over here, and this is going to create us a nice loop. And from the true value, I'm just going to simply copy these nodes. So I'm going to reset the amount that is needed to be removed. And for the bottom minus, of course, we are plugging that into our local the found stack amount. There we go. So this is all set up. And now all that's needed for us to do is simply return true once we are done with this loop. There we go. So we are returning true, and well, we are all good with this function. So we are first checking whether we have plenty of resources. If we don't, well, it's instantly giving us back information like, no, this is what not successful, we don't have plenty of items. But if this returns true, then that means, well, we can look for those items because we have them, and we can slowly remove one by one, and the rest of the execution pins do not need to be returned since they are, well, in a loop. So now I will delete the rest that I had from the previous function, compile and save this, and we are all good with this function. So now if you want to remove an amount of items, you don't know its index, you just simply run your remove item, input the item, and it's going to remove it for you. Now we also have set this up to be functioning in the backpack as well. We are not checking whether if it's valid or not because, well, if we have found it in our return stacks function, that means it is valid because we are checking it in that function over there. And we don't necessarily need these functions in our backpack master, but just to be sure, maybe in the future we do need those. I'm going to add those. So I will go to the backpack master, and this is going to be really quick and simple. So I'm going to go to the return stacks first, and I'm just going to simply copy. Let's see, let's copy only the top part because we don't need the bottom one. So let's copy that in the backpack master. Let's create the return stacks, paste that in, and in this case we don't need the is valid, we don't need the player slots and the equip backpack. Let's just simply plug in the S slot structure over here. I'm going to rename this to be the item. And we can just simply run this loop directly without having to check whether something is valid or something is not, because, well, in the backpack everything is going to be valid. We just need to plug in the slots variable from our backpack. Also, we want to promote our local variables, so right click, create local variable on this one, and create local variable on this one as well. And then from the completion we can return. So let's return node. This needs a couple of outputs, so I'm just going to simply drag in these local variables right here and plug them into over here, and this automatically creates them. I'm just going to simply remove the local and 1 to make this look a little bit nicer and shorter. There we go. So we have set up this function. Now for our remove item, it's just like we had in our third person character. So I'm going to do the same thing, go to the remove items function, and I'm just going to simply copy this whole thing, copy it, and make sure that in the backpack master in your return stacks you have the inventory over here rather than the player, in case if you copied the other part. So over here then in the remove item, I'm just going to copy all of this in. This is going to give a couple of errors, of course, because, well, we don't have the equip backpacks and we don't have the find stack functions the same way we have in our third person character. So I'm going to unplug this, go down, plug this in. So let's see, first promote this to a local variable, so our local item, plug in, make sure you set your value, don't leave it empty. Then so we are running the return stacks, which is getting ran properly for me since I have the same inputs, outputs, and the same function name. Let's go further along. It does use the same switch, but in this case, well, we are only going to return the inventory, so there is going to be no player slots. So technically what you can do is instead of running a switch, you can simply check whether your item source is equal to the inventory. Then you can run a if branch check on this one. There we go, plug that into the loop body, and if that is true, then we can run the top portion of this function. So on true, we run that. We keep ourselves the break loop as well. Then we can delete the bottom part since we don't have the player slots. All we have is our backpack slots in here. And so let's see, we don't need the equip backpack since we can use the local find stack function, and everything else seems to be just fine. Oh, make sure to remove this one as well. There we go. And I believe we are all good and done with this. So that's gonna be it for today's video. Now if you want to remove an item, just simply run a function. Probably in your third person character would be better since it is checking for both for the backpack and the player slots, and it's gonna remove the necessary amount. Doesn't matter of in which index that is. So like always, thank you guys for watching, and I see you tomorrow in the next video where we're gonna optimize our crafting system next.